So I often hear that this is the most divided time that we have right now in our politics. I hear that often. I kind of struggle with that because I'm thinking of, I don't know, the Civil War. I'm thinking of 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson against, Barry Goldwater. I think it was pretty divided. But I also think of the 90s, and I think of Ken Starr. Ken Starr, who recently passed away of 76 years old. He was the independent counsel who pursued President Clinton. He was also on Trump's team fighting against impeachment for all the folks who think there was a different kind of Republican back then. And this was also a very divisive time. I don't think this was a time of great unity. I was just wondering, again, as somebody who worked in the White House, what are your reflections on Ken Starr? And do you think it's gotten more divisive, or do you think that it was just as bad in the 1990s?
Well, I didn't live the 1860s or the 1960s per se, but I did live the 1990s. And I was there in the White House when Ken Starr was around, actually not at the same time when he introduced his investigation. But I can say this, I don't think the country was anywhere nearly as divided in 1990 as it is today. I don't think Ken Starr's investigation was very popular. I think the Republicans thought it was, which is the reason why they impeached Bill Clinton in 1998. But they actually lost in the midterms in 1998. They didn't make up the ground they thought they would make up in the midterm election with the incumbent president, where usually the party out of power gains. They didn't make those huge gains, in large part because they overreached. They were going after Bill Clinton, essentially attacking Bill Clinton, trying to bring down his presidency because of a consensual extramarital affair. That was the whole basis of it. And the reality was they didn't even care about consensual extramarital affairs because everyone from Newt Gingrich on down was already having those affairs. Yeah, but Ken Starr was the epitome of the Republican overreach in the 1990s. I do have to say this, though. I think in the context of division, Bill Clinton was very, very popular after that impeachment. Donald Trump was not popular after his impeachment. And that is the difference. The country believed in and agreed with Bill Clinton. The country doesn't believe in and agree with what Donald Trump was doing, but there was a small vocal minority that is determined to impose his type of racial fascism on America. So when I answer that question about how divided our country is, irrespective of Ken Starr, I think our country is more divided now than any time it has been in my lifetime. That's what I say to that. And that includes, to a certain extent, the civil rights era, because I was born in 1965. But what I mean by that is that we are now facing a situation we've never had before, where we have millions and millions of people, tens of millions of people who are not in any way committed to or expressing any belief in the fundamental system of American democracy. Now, we had that arguably for hundreds of years in America because of enslavement and segregation. But what's happened now is that we have a political party that is chosen to one political party is chosen essentially to deny democracy altogether. And that's a dangerous moment we're in right now. I don't think in the 1960s anyone was thinking about the possibility of civil war. I honestly think we are on the verge of potentially embracing or approaching a civil war in our country today, because of what's happened in the past 5 years. That is unprecedented. Certainly not as bad as we were in 1860, but we are worse than any time it's been in half a century for sure.
It's interesting, Keith. You have me thinking here because I am, no fan of Reagan. Reagan was horrendous, and we're still suffering because of his policies. But what I was born in 77. So I remember, when I'm a kid, I remember the Reagan years. I was born and raised on welfare. He shitted on the middle class, homelessness spiked. I mean, Reagan was horrendous. Reagan actually policy wise created more damage than Trump because Reagan had 8 years. But what is interesting, now that I'm hearing you say this, because there is this discussion about where are we and being more divided than ever, that you are right that under the Reagan years, and I would probably argue even under the Nixon and Ford years and Carter, but Republican presidents, there wasn't a discussion about our democracy ending. Now, mind you, they were using horrible racist tactics. Reagan had the welfare queen narrative, the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, the same act in 1988. You know, there was these horrible tactics that I guess maybe had a veneer of being civil. But you are right that it's interesting that it wasn't about democracy ending. It wasn't about doubting an election. I mean, of course, you have Reagan supporting apartheid. I don't want anybody to think I'm downplaying how insidious Reagan was, but there is something to that. In this moment, it is the fundamental question, the question of how we are functioning as a democracy. And you have one party who says, if we don't win, then our democracy must end. And that is, I guess, more so similar to the Confederacy than anything else. I would argue, but that I haven't thought about. You're right. I can't stand Reagan. I thought Nixon was terrible, although he did some good things for Black businesses, but it wasn't about the question of our democracy. That's interesting to me.
Well, you're right, and there's a progression here. You know, going back to the civil rights movement, it starts with Nixon, where there is a delegitimization of federal government. And Nixon uses the federal government, of course, for the Environmental Protection Act and to expand the government in terms of international relations, but delegitimizes the federal government in terms of its ability to focus on racial justice issues. That begins in the Nixon administration. Then we go into the Reagan administration, another Republican in the 1980s, and Reagan delegitimizes government altogether. He says that government is not the solution, government is the problem. That's Reaganomics. That is essentially what Reagan stood for. And we are still paying the price for that declaration, for those policies that deconstructed the government in our country, that slashed the top marginal tax rate from 70% to 28%. That means that we defunded our cities and communities. And all the places where people are saying, well, the Black Bears are responsible for the water in Jackson, Mississippi, and the Democratic mayors are responsible for the water in Flint, Michigan. We know the reality is that the mayors don't make a lot of decisions because they rely on funding from the state and federal government. But the Reagan administration began the policy of defunding those cities and states and helping to support the suburbs instead, which are predominantly white, and transferring trillions of dollars of wealth from Black and brown communities in the inner cities to white communities in the suburbs. That all started in the Reagan administration. Then we get to the Bush administration, and he devalues federal government and all government because of his incompetence. And finally, we get to the Trump administration, where he doesn't just devalue government and delegitimize government, but he delegitimizes democracy itself. And that's what makes him empirically worse, in my opinion, than Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, Richard Nixon, or every other president in our history, Republican, Democrat, Whig, Federalist, or anything else. Donald Trump is the first president in the history of the United States Republic who was unwilling to commit himself to the basic transfer of power, unwilling to commit himself to the idea that democracy means that the person who wins the election gets to be the president. And when you have a person like that who is still alive and not in jail and still making statements that are untrue and undermining democracy, that puts us in a perilous position. For a president of the United States to be able to make those comments in 2022 and not be held accountable is a serious threat to our democracy. And Donald Trump alone is not the cause of the erosion of democracy, but he tapped into a core of people who he knew who were alienated because of their whiteness and feeling that they didn't like the idea of Black and brown people and LGBTQIA people and women and others becoming powerful. He knew that he could get those people to be upset enough to target their anger at everyone else except the rich and white powerful men who run the country.